Rachel Reeves thought she had it all under control. A calculated move to reinforce Labour's economic credibility, a bold stance on fiscal discipline, and a carefully crafted policy designed to prove that the party could be trusted with public finances. But in just a matter of days, that confidence has crumbled into chaos. Labour's leadership has been blindsided, Starmer's authority is in free fall, and Reeves, once positioned as the iron-willed architect of Labour's economic plan, has been utterly humiliated in front of the nation. How did this happen? How did a policy designed to demonstrate Labour's strength turn into its biggest moment of weakness? The answer lies in a staggering miscalculation, a gross underestimation of the backlash, and a leadership so disconnected from its own party that it failed to see the political firestorm brewing right beneath its feet. Because this wasn't just another policy debate, this was an all-out rebellion, a moment where Labour's fragile unity was ripped apart in the public eye. And when Reeves sat down for that now infamous television interview, she wasn't facing journalists, she was facing the full weight of Labour's collapse. This was supposed to be a defining moment for Labour, a chance to show fiscal responsibility without alienating core voters. Instead, it has exposed the party's deepest fractures. Reeves and Starmer thought they could push through £5 billion in welfare cuts, framing it as a necessary step to control spending. But what they didn't expect was the sheer scale of the outrage, not just from the opposition, but from their own ranks. The backlash was immediate, it was brutal, and it came from Labour MPs who had once been considered loyal. Angela Rayner, Ed Miliband, and a growing number of backbenchers saw the proposal as an unforgivable betrayal, a move that went against the very principles Labour was supposed to stand for. And they wasted no time in making their fury known. This wasn't quiet dissent, it was open defiance. Labour MPs took to the media, denounced the policy in Parliament, and issued a direct challenge to Reeves and Starmer's leadership. The message was clear: they would not allow this to pass. And then came the media storm. Reeves found herself in the centre of a relentless firestorm, facing questions she had no good answers to. How could Labour justify targeting the most vulnerable while allowing tax loopholes to remain untouched? Why was the party, supposedly the defender of working-class Britain, proposing cuts that would push disabled people further into poverty? And why, in the midst of a cost-of-living crisis, was Labour choosing to balance the books on the backs of those who could least afford it? Reeves stammered. She deflected. She tried to pivot. But the damage was done. Viewers watched as she struggled to defend a policy that was already collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. This wasn't just an uncomfortable interview, it was a moment of complete political humiliation. The shadow chancellor of the Labour Party, the woman who was meant to be the economic mastermind behind Starmer's government-in-waiting, was utterly exposed. And it didn't stop there. What followed was even more devastating. As pressure mounted, Labour's leadership began to fracture. At first, Starmer and Reeves attempted to stand firm, insisting that the policy was still under review. Then, as dissent grew louder, the messaging shifted. Briefings were leaked suggesting that the proposal was being reconsidered. Anonymous Labour insiders hinted that the policy was never set in stone. And then, in the final act of capitulation, the entire plan was quietly dropped, buried under a flood of damage control statements designed to make the public forget it had ever existed. But the public won't forget. The media won't forget. And Labour's MPs certainly won't forget. Because this wasn't just a policy U-turn, it was a complete loss of authority. It proved that Starmer and Reeves are not in control of their own party, that they can be forced into submission by internal rebellion, and that when the pressure is on, they fold. And this is where the real danger begins. Because now, Labour's left-wing MPs know they have the power to overrule their leadership. They saw what happened when they stood their ground. They forced a reversal on a flagship economic policy. And that victory will embolden them. They won't stop here. They will push back harder against any future attempts at fiscal discipline, they will demand a return to full-throttle left-wing economics, and they will make Starmer's life a living nightmare in the months leading up to the next general election. Meanwhile, Labour's credibility is in free fall. The entire justification for Starmer's leadership was that he would bring stability, that he would present Labour as a serious alternative to the Conservative government, that he would prove the party could be trusted with the economy. But this fiasco has blown that illusion apart. If Labour collapses under the weight of its own policies before even reaching government, what happens when it's actually in power? If Starmer cannot stand up to his own MPs now, how can he expect to govern a country in crisis? And then there's the question of public trust. Labour thought it could win over centrists with this proposal, but now they've alienated everyone. Left-wing voters are furious that the policy was ever considered. Swing voters see a party that is divided, indecisive, and incapable of making tough decisions. And the right now has the perfect attack line: Labour caves under pressure. Labour is weak. Labour cannot be trusted. This has been a catastrophe on every level. Reeves' credibility has been shattered. Starmer's authority has been undermined. The Labour Party is in turmoil. And with a general election on the horizon, this could be the moment that destroys their entire campaign. Because this wasn't just a mistake, it was a moment of complete and utter failure. A failure of leadership, a failure of judgment, and a failure to understand the political reality they were walking into. And now the question hangs over the party like a guillotine: can Labour recover from this? Or has the damage already been done? Labour is falling apart, and the entire country is watching. What was supposed to be a carefully orchestrated display of fiscal discipline has erupted into an all-out civil war. The rebellion within the party is no longer just a murmur of discontent, it is a full-scale uprising, a moment of reckoning that threatens to shatter Keir Starmer's authority and redefine the future of the Labour Party. This is not just about a single policy misstep. This is about power. And the left-wing faction of Labour has just sent a clear message: they will not be ignored, they will not be silenced, and they will not stand by as their own leadership betrays the party's core values. Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer thought they could impose economic orthodoxy without consequence. They assumed that their MPs would fall in line, that the media would move on, that the public would accept the need for fiscal restraint. But they have gravely miscalculated. The backlash to their proposed disability benefits freeze has torn open deep divisions within Labour, and those divisions are now impossible to contain. The left is in revolt, and they are making it clear that they will not stop until Reeves and Starmer abandon not just this policy, but their entire approach to economic governance. Angela Rayner, Ed Miliband, and a growing faction of backbench MPs have seized the moment, using the crisis to expose what they see as the leadership's betrayal of the party's working-class roots. This is not just a policy disagreement, this is an existential fight over what Labour should stand for. And right now, it is Starmer and Reeves who are on the defensive, scrambling to contain the damage as their own party turns against them. Behind closed doors, the panic is palpable. Emergency meetings, frantic calls, desperate attempts at damage control, all signs of a leadership that knows it is losing control. Starmer may have spent years consolidating his grip over Labour, purging the hard left and steering the party toward the centre, but now, for the first time, he is facing a rebellion he cannot suppress. Because this time, the opposition is not coming from a fringe faction, it is coming from within his own ranks, from MPs with influence, with media presence, and with the power to bring his leadership to its knees. The scenes unfolding in Westminster are nothing short of extraordinary. Labour MPs, who only months ago were marching in lockstep behind Starmer, are now openly defying him. Statements condemning the policy have poured in from across the party. Some MPs have outright refused to support the leadership's position. Others are warning of further revolts if Starmer does not change course. And the momentum is growing. The longer this crisis drags on, the more it emboldens those who see this as an opportunity to reshape Labour in their own image. The betrayal cuts deep. Labour's working-class supporters, the very people who the party was created to defend, are watching in disbelief as their supposed champions debate whether to squeeze welfare spending while the cost of living spirals out of control. The optics are devastating. A Labour Party that promised compassion now looks callous. A leadership that promised competence now looks weak. And a party that prided itself on unity is now being ripped apart by internal warfare. And it is not just MPs who are furious. Labour members, activists, and affiliated unions are voicing their outrage, making it clear that they will not support a leadership that abandons the most vulnerable. Constituency offices have been flooded with complaints. Party officials have been bombarded with demands for change. And Starmer, who once prided himself on party discipline, now faces the very real prospect of a leadership crisis if he does not find a way to appease his own side. The timing of this implosion could not be worse. With a general election on the horizon, Labour was supposed to be presenting itself as a government in waiting, a credible alternative to the chaos of Conservative rule. Instead, it now looks like a party on the verge of collapse, consumed by infighting and incapable of decisive leadership. The Conservatives, struggling under the weight of their own scandals and economic mismanagement, have been handed a lifeline. Because while Labour tears itself apart, Rishi Sunak and his allies are watching with glee, ready to exploit every misstep, every hesitation, and every sign of weakness. The media, too, has seized on the spectacle. Headlines scream of Labour's internal war, of Starmer's crumbling authority, of a party divided against itself. Political commentators, who only weeks ago were discussing Labour's inevitability as the next government, are now questioning whether Starmer can even hold his party together long enough to make it to the election. And every passing day without resolution only cements the narrative that Labour is not ready to govern, that it is just as dysfunctional, just as chaotic, and just as out of touch as the Conservatives. So what happens now? The pressure on Starmer is immense. Does he stand by Reeves and risk an even greater rebellion? Or does he retreat entirely, sacrificing his economic strategy in a desperate attempt to salvage party unity? Either option comes with consequences. If he stands firm, he will face a mutiny from within his own ranks, potentially losing control of the party. If he backs down, he will look weak, indecisive, and incapable of governing under pressure. And this is exactly the nightmare scenario the Tories have been waiting for. Every policy reversal, every sign of Labour's internal dysfunction, every indication that Starmer does not have full control over his party will be weaponized in the next election. The attack lines write themselves. Labour cannot be trusted with the economy. Labour is divided. Labour is not ready for power. Meanwhile, Rachel Reeves has been politically wounded in a way that may never fully heal. She was meant to be Labour's economic heavyweight, the figure who could stand up to Conservative chancellors and prove that the party had learned from past mistakes. Instead, she has been left exposed, battered by criticism, and forced into a defensive crouch as her own colleagues turn against her. Her authority has been shattered. Her credibility has been eroded. And the damage to her reputation may be irreversible. Labour wanted to prove that it was strong. Instead, it has proven the exact opposite. The left-wing rebellion has shown that Starmer and Reeves can be overruled, that their authority is not absolute, and that their attempts to impose centrist economic policies will not go unchallenged. The cracks in Labour's foundation are now visible for all to see, and those cracks will only widen as the party's internal war escalates. This is not just a bad week for Labour, this is a defining crisis, a moment that could reshape the party for years to come. And the worst part? It was entirely self-inflicted. Starmer and Reeves did not just miscalculate the reaction to their policy, they miscalculated the loyalty of their own party. And now, as the rebellion grows, as Labour's internal divisions become impossible to ignore, and as the Conservatives prepare to exploit every moment of this chaos, the question looms over the party like a sword ready to fall: can Labour survive this disaster? Or is this the beginning of its downfall? Keir Starmer has surrendered. Under immense pressure from his own party, the opposition, and the public, the Labour leader has caved in spectacular fashion. What was meant to be a show of economic responsibility has become a symbol of political cowardice, a humiliating U-turn that has left his leadership in tatters. Rachel Reeves, once touted as the iron-fisted guardian of fiscal discipline, has been forced into retreat, exposed as weak and unprepared for the storm that followed her ill-fated proposal. This is not just a misstep. This is a catastrophe that threatens to redefine Labour's credibility at a crucial moment in British politics. Labour thought it could quietly push through £5 billion in welfare cuts, framing them as necessary adjustments in the name of economic prudence. But Starmer and Reeves gravely underestimated the ferocity of the backlash. The moment the proposal leaked, all hell broke loose. The public was outraged. Labour's own MPs rebelled. Disability rights activists launched fierce campaigns against the policy. Social media erupted with condemnation. And suddenly, the leadership found itself backed into a corner with no way out. At first, Labour's response was pure arrogance. Reeves doubled down, insisting that difficult choices had to be made. Starmer remained silent, hoping that the storm would pass. But it didn't. The backlash only intensified, exposing just how out of touch the leadership had become. Did they really think they could impose austerity on the most vulnerable without a fight? Did they not anticipate the rebellion brewing within their own ranks? It was a stunning display of political naivety. And then, the inevitable happened. Faced with an internal mutiny and a complete collapse in public support, Labour executed a humiliating retreat. The policy was scrapped. Not adjusted. Not reconsidered. Scrapped. And just like that, Starmer and Reeves had given their enemies the perfect weapon. The Tories pounced, portraying Labour as weak, divided, and incapable of sticking to its own economic policies. Right-wing commentators had a field day, mocking Reeves for her inability to defend her own agenda. And perhaps most damaging of all, left-wing activists within Labour now saw blood in the water. They had challenged Starmer's authority, and won. This retreat is more than just an embarrassing blunder. It is an existential crisis for Labour's leadership. Because now, the left of the party knows it can overrule Starmer. It has discovered that if it applies enough pressure, if it makes enough noise, if it threatens enough rebellion, the leadership will crumble. That knowledge will shape every future policy debate within the party. Starmer thought he had consolidated control over Labour, but this U-turn has proven otherwise. The cracks in his authority are now impossible to ignore. And what about Reeves? Her entire political brand was built on the promise of economic toughness, on the idea that she was different from previous Labour chancellors who had shied away from difficult decisions. She was meant to be the person who would convince the business community that Labour could be trusted with the economy. That reputation has now been obliterated. If she cannot even stand firm on her own policies in opposition, how can she be expected to handle economic crises in government? She has been exposed as weak, indecisive, and utterly incapable of managing a political firestorm. Her credibility is in ruins. The timing of this disaster could not be worse. The general election is fast approaching, and Labour was supposed to be presenting itself as a government in waiting. Instead, it looks like a party on the brink of implosion. The Conservatives, despite their own myriad scandals and economic failures, now have a golden opportunity to redefine the election narrative. For months, Labour has been hammering the Tories over their disunity and incompetence. But this fiasco has handed Rishi Sunak a devastating counter-argument. If Labour cannot even handle policy in opposition, how can it be trusted to run the country? The retreat has also raised serious doubts among key voter demographics. Left-wing supporters feel betrayed that Labour even considered such a policy. Swing voters, who had begun to trust Labour's economic credibility, now see a party that makes decisions on the fly and reverses them under pressure. And business leaders, who Reeves was desperately trying to court, now question whether Labour has the backbone to implement any tough economic reforms at all. The worst of all possible worlds, Labour has alienated its base, lost the confidence of the centre, and handed its opponents an easy attack line. And let's not forget the media. Starmer and Reeves are now enduring relentless scrutiny from all sides. Political analysts, journalists, and commentators are dissecting their failure in brutal detail. The headlines write themselves: Labour in chaos, Starmer's authority shattered, Rachel Reeves humiliated on live TV. And this is not a story that will simply fade away. The damage has been done. The perception that Labour is weak, indecisive, and incapable of strong leadership has taken root, and it will haunt the party in every debate, every interview, and every campaign event leading up to the election. This entire debacle was avoidable. Labour did not have to make this proposal. It did not have to pick a fight over welfare cuts in the middle of a cost-of-living crisis. It did not have to create a policy that contradicted its own messaging about protecting the vulnerable. But it did. And then, when it realized the scale of the backlash, it panicked. There was no strategy, no clear defense, no decisive leadership. Just chaos, hesitation, and a desperate attempt to retreat before the damage got even worse. So where does Labour go from here? The road ahead is bleak. The leadership must now contend with a party that no longer respects its authority, a public that is rapidly losing faith, and an opposition that has been given the easiest political attack line in years. Starmer will try to move on, to shift the focus to Tory failures, to pretend this was just a minor blip. But the damage has already been done. He has been exposed as a leader who folds under pressure. Reeves has been exposed as a chancellor-in-waiting who cannot defend her own policies. And the left-wing rebels within Labour have been emboldened, ready to challenge the leadership again at the next opportunity. This was not just a policy reversal. This was a moment that revealed the fundamental weakness at the heart of Starmer's Labour Party. A party that is not in control of its own direction. A party that is consumed by internal divisions. A party that claims to be ready for government but cannot even maintain discipline in opposition. And the most damning question of all now hangs over Starmer and Reeves. If they cannot withstand the pressure now, what happens when the real tests of leadership begin? The answer is terrifying, for them, and for the future of the Labour Party. The Labour Party is imploding before our very eyes. What was once hailed as a party on the brink of reclaiming power is now in complete disarray. Starmer's leadership is unraveling at an alarming rate, his authority shredded by internal rebellion, public outrage, and a growing perception that Labour is just as incompetent and divided as the Conservatives. This isn't just a setback, it's a full-scale crisis that has left the party's credibility in ruins. And the worst part? It was entirely self-inflicted. Labour had spent years trying to rebuild trust, convincing the electorate that it had moved beyond the factional chaos of the Corbyn years. It was supposed to be the party of stability, competence, and responsible governance. But this debacle has laid those illusions to waste. The proposed disability benefits freeze wasn't just a political misstep, it was a betrayal, a direct attack on the very people Labour claimed to represent. And the backlash has been ferocious. Voters who once looked to Labour as a champion of the working class now see a party willing to throw the most vulnerable under the bus to balance the books. Disability rights groups have launched a relentless campaign against Starmer and Reeves, exposing the devastating real-world consequences of their disastrous proposal. Social media is ablaze with condemnation. Labour MPs' inboxes are flooded with furious messages from constituents who feel abandoned. And the leadership, now fully aware of the catastrophe they've unleashed, is scrambling to contain the fallout. The media is having a field day. Headlines scream of Labour's betrayal, of Starmer's crumbling leadership, of Rachel Reeves' shattered credibility. Political commentators who had once cautiously praised Labour's discipline are now openly questioning whether the party is even fit to govern. Even left-leaning publications, typically sympathetic to Labour's cause, are struggling to defend this catastrophe. And the right-wing press? They are in absolute ecstasy. The Tories have been gifted the easiest political attack line in years. Labour is weak, Labour is divided, Labour cannot be trusted. And then there's the rebellion within Labour itself. This is not just a handful of disgruntled MPs. This is a full-scale mutiny. Angela Rayner, Ed Miliband, and an entire faction of left-wing Labour MPs have openly defied Starmer's leadership, forcing him into an embarrassing U-turn that has shattered any illusion of control. They saw an opportunity, and they took it. They challenged Starmer's authority, and they won. And now, with blood in the water, they will not stop. This is no longer just about the benefits freeze. This is about power. The balance within Labour has shifted, and Starmer is no longer the undisputed leader he once thought he was. The real danger for Starmer and Reeves is what comes next. Because this rebellion has exposed a fundamental weakness in Labour's foundation. If Starmer can be forced into submission this easily, what happens when the next policy dispute arises? What happens when the left demands more radical spending commitments? What happens when they push back against any attempt to appeal to centrist voters? Starmer is trapped. If he leans too far left, he risks alienating the very voters he has spent years trying to win back. If he pushes too far right, he faces another internal revolt. Either way, he is no longer in control of his own party. And the Conservatives? They are watching this chaos unfold with barely disguised glee. After months of scandals and crises, Labour's implosion has given them an unexpected lifeline. For months, Labour had successfully attacked the Tories for their incompetence, their corruption, their failure to govern. But now, the tables have turned. Now, it is Labour that looks shambolic. It is Labour that is consumed by infighting. It is Labour that has been exposed as weak and indecisive. And the Tories will waste no time exploiting this to the fullest. Rishi Sunak and his ministers are already sharpening their attack lines. Expect to hear them hammer Labour at every opportunity. They say they're ready to govern, but they can't even govern themselves. If they crumble in opposition, imagine the chaos if they were in power. Labour is just as divided and incompetent as ever. These are devastating narratives, and the worst part is that they are now entirely plausible. But the real damage is to public perception. Because this fiasco has fundamentally altered the way voters see Labour. For years, Starmer has carefully crafted an image of stability, of quiet competence, of a leader who could be trusted to run the country. That image has now been shattered. The benefits freeze scandal has made Starmer look weak, indecisive, and disconnected from the realities faced by ordinary people. Reeves, once seen as a credible chancellor-in-waiting, now looks like a political liability, a figure unable to defend her own economic policies. And Labour as a whole? It now looks just as unreliable, just as chaotic, just as incapable as the party it seeks to replace. This is not a minor setback. This is a turning point. Labour was supposed to be cruising to electoral victory. It was supposed to be the stable, competent alternative to a failing Conservative government. Instead, it is now embroiled in an internal war, bleeding support from all sides, and facing a credibility crisis that could define the next general election. The question now is simple: can Labour recover from this disaster? Or has this crisis revealed a party that is simply not ready for power? Because make no mistake, this is not just about one policy blunder. This is about a fundamental failure of leadership. Starmer and Reeves were supposed to be the adults in the room, the figures who would restore Labour's credibility and discipline. Instead, they have been exposed as weak, reactive, and incapable of standing firm when it matters. And now, as the rebellion grows, as the backlash intensifies, and as the Tories prepare to weaponize this crisis for all it's worth, Labour is left facing a terrifying reality: they may have just thrown away their greatest chance at power in a generation. Keir Starmer is in free fall. What started as a calculated political move to prove Labour's economic credibility has spiraled into one of the worst crises the party has faced in years. His authority has collapsed, his chancellor-in-waiting has been humiliated, and the party he once controlled with an iron grip is now at war with itself. The Tory government, battered and scandal-ridden, should have been on the ropes. Instead, they are watching gleefully as Labour self-destructs in real time. This is not just a blunder, it is an existential catastrophe that could reshape British politics. Labour thought it could get away with this. Starmer and Reeves assumed they could impose their economic orthodoxy without consequence. They believed that a policy targeting disability benefits would be seen as a necessary sacrifice, a demonstration of fiscal responsibility that would reassure business leaders and centrist voters. But they miscalculated, catastrophically. The backlash was immediate, ferocious, and impossible to contain. The public was outraged. Labour's own MPs revolted. And Starmer, the man who was supposed to offer stable, competent leadership, was left floundering. The attempt to freeze disability benefits was not just a bad policy, it was a political betrayal. For years, Labour has positioned itself as the defender of the working class, the champion of those left behind by Tory austerity. And yet here they were, proposing to balance the books on the backs of the most vulnerable. It was a move so politically tone-deaf, so devoid of basic moral calculation, that it shattered any remaining trust many voters had in Starmer's leadership. If Labour is willing to sacrifice disabled people to prove its fiscal discipline, what else will it be willing to compromise on? The rebellion within the party has exposed a truth Starmer cannot ignore: he is no longer in control. For years, he methodically consolidated power, marginalizing the left, positioning himself as the unchallenged leader of a disciplined, professional Labour Party. That illusion has now been obliterated. The revolt led by Angela Rayner, Ed Miliband, and a growing faction of left-wing MPs was not just about one policy, it was a direct challenge to Starmer's authority. And they won. They forced him into a U-turn so humiliating that it will define his leadership for years to come. The moment he backed down, he sent a message to his entire party: he can be overruled. And once that perception takes hold, it is almost impossible to reverse. And Reeves? Her political career may never recover. She was meant to be the tough, no-nonsense economic chief who would reassure the markets, the figure who would finally rid Labour of its reputation for fiscal irresponsibility. Now, she is a liability, a leader who could not even defend her own policy when faced with the slightest resistance. Her credibility has been shattered, her authority destroyed. If she cannot even stand by her own economic vision now, how can she possibly function as Chancellor in a Labour government? The consequences of this disaster extend far beyond Reeves and Starmer. Labour's entire election strategy is now in ruins. They were meant to be the steady, competent alternative to Tory chaos. Now, they are the ones engulfed in turmoil. The Conservatives, despite their own collapsing credibility, have been handed a perfect attack line: Labour is weak, Labour is divided, Labour cannot be trusted to govern. And that message is already resonating. Swing voters who were cautiously warming to Starmer are now having second thoughts. The business community, which Reeves was desperate to court, now sees a party that panics under pressure. And Labour's own core supporters? They are furious. The betrayal of disabled people has sparked outrage across the country. Grassroots activists, unions, and disability rights organisations have turned against Labour with a level of anger not seen in years. Constituency offices are flooded with complaints. MPs are being confronted by their own voters. Labour's carefully crafted image as the party of social justice has been destroyed. And no amount of spin will make that anger disappear. The media is relentless. Every headline screams of Labour's weakness, its collapse, its utter failure of leadership. Commentators who once spoke cautiously of Labour's path to power are now openly questioning whether Starmer can even survive until the next election. The Conservatives, despite their own internal struggles, are capitalising on the moment, framing Labour's implosion as proof that they remain the only party capable of governing Britain. The irony is brutal. After months of Tory scandals, it is Labour that is now drowning in its own crisis. And the worst part? This is only the beginning. The left within Labour has been emboldened. They now know they can force Starmer's hand. They know that if they make enough noise, if they organise effectively, they can push him into retreat. This benefits freeze may have been the first battle, but it will not be the last. Every future policy Starmer and Reeves attempt to introduce will now be met with scrutiny, opposition, and the looming threat of another internal rebellion. The party is no longer theirs to control. What does Labour do now? There is no easy way out of this mess. Starmer could try to reassert his authority, but that would risk further alienating the left-wing MPs who have just proven their power. He could attempt to appease them, but that would only reinforce the perception that he is weak and indecisive. And all the while, the Tories will be watching, waiting for every mistake, ready to pounce at the first sign of further disarray. This crisis is not just an embarrassment, it is a warning. Labour is not the disciplined, unified force it claimed to be. It is fragile, unstable, and more vulnerable than anyone realised. If it is already crumbling under the pressure of opposition, how can it possibly hope to survive the pressures of government? For months, Starmer's team has operated under the assumption that the next election is Labour's to lose. That assumption now lies in ruins. The party is in chaos. Its leadership is in question. Its credibility is shattered. And unless Starmer can find a way to repair the damage, and fast, this could be the moment that defines his downfall. Because the public is watching. The media is circling. And the question everyone is asking is the one Starmer should fear the most: has Labour already lost the election before the campaign has even begun?